So who's seen Summer of Soul? It was an amazing picture, I think. The story and the music of the 1969 Harlem Cultural Festival that ran concurrent to Woodstock and brought to the stage some of the most talented and impactful musicians of the era, perhaps any era, certainly in recent memory. It also won Best Documentary at the Oscars last Sunday. Of course, you may not know that, because the person who gave the award was none other than Chris Rock, who was at the moment reeling from the slap. And I don't think I need to explain what happened. If you don't know what I'm talking about, either you're fighting for your life in Ukraine or you're from another planet, so Google it after Shabbos if you're not sure. But what I want to do today is offer a sort of brief crash course in Jewish ethics, not because the events of last Sunday were Jewish in any particular way. The participants of the melee were not Jewish, but reflecting on that moment, I can't help but think that in a few short minutes, viewers around the world were granted a window into a range of aspects of the human condition. Now, I'm not a political commentator, though I highlight politics when they elucidate aspects of our tradition, or when I believe our Jewish tradition has something to say about the geopolitical or domestic policy concerns of our day. I'm certainly not an entertainment reporter, nor a Hollywood buff, really. I met my wife, a fellow Midwesterner, when we were both living in LA, and then we promptly got the heck out of there. But sometimes the world, politics, entertainment, art, literature, offers us lessons. And if Judaism is a way of life and not something markedly narrower or shallower or esotericer, then it ought to have something to say about Will Smith, Chris Rock, and this year's Oscars. But my goal today, as you can see, is not to stand up there and preach as I might typically do. I'm actually interested in getting a little bit of discussion going. One of the things that I've really missed during the COVID era is our Kesher Shabbat services downstairs in our Beit Midrash and in our chapel before that. And when we were downstairs, and when we will be again, hopefully in the not too distant future, sometimes we'd forego a more traditional Devar Torah, sometimes I'd do a text study, or there's a long-standing tradition at Beth Am of doing discussions. We would listen to each other, we would talk to each other, we would learn together and from one another. And so what I want to do today is I'd like to hear, taking just a couple of minutes, what societal issues, what ethical concerns arose for you as you considered what went down on that stage. And meanwhile, I'll try to offer a few sources that may point us toward perhaps a Jewish way of understanding those events. So a couple of ground rules to start. One, if you speak, please speak only if you're interested also in listening. Two, let's try to make space for multiple voices and perspectives. Three, let's be mindful of the ways that words can cause both healing and harm, and strive to offer our comments and questions in ways that honor the humanity and the Tzelem Elohim, the godliness of each person in this room and beyond. And finally, today was, as you know, a 3 Torah Shabbat. So I learned early on in this business, don't stand between Jews and food. So if I say, okay, we're going to wrap up, please forgive me if you didn't get a chance to share everything that you wished you could. Consider it an invitation to continue the conversation at Kiddush lunch. Sound good? Okay. So let's just open it up. I'm not passing a mic around. Folks at home, I'll do my best to relay what was said here in the room as best as I can to you. So if you want to say something, maybe just stand at your seat and speak loudly, and we'll kind of take it from there. So what for you were the issues, the sort of underlying issue that you may have noticed or maybe have been talking about with your family, with your friends, on social media, whatever, since the events of last Sunday? Yeah, Desiree. True. Uh-huh. Yeah. Uh-huh. And can I pinpoint it first? So Desiree said that it uplifted for her the question of shame, the issue of shame, and was referencing our scholar in residence, Dr. Sarah Wolf, who last Shabbos, actually after Kiddush lunch, taught a session about shame in Jewish tradition. And can you pinpoint what for you? Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So, but was it like the shame? Who felt shame for you in that moment at the Oscars? Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay. So it was the joke that was shaming maybe Jada Pinkett Smith and her husband sort of reacting to that shame. Okay. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Uh-huh. So if anybody didn't hear, so what Dee is saying is that there were millions of people watching around the world who could believe that something like that could happen, and yet here was this personal kind of human moment about a husband and a wife and the reaction. Okay, great. Let's put a few things, other things on the table before I share what I think were maybe some Jewish context. So any other issues came up for you? Yeah, please, Henry. Maybe stand up and just speak loudly, please. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there was something about like one's career, one's reputation, that also was a question of like, how do you build a reputation? How quickly can things turn? How can a reputation be destroyed or degraded? How quickly because of sort of one event? Other issues that came up for you? Yeah, Alan. Mm-hmm. Okay, so for you, it sounds like a big issue is communication, how communication is done in the 21st century, social media, maybe this question of canceling, and the sort of the long-term impact of a communication or a miscommunication. Okay, great, thanks. Let's get maybe a couple more. Yeah, one and then two. Go ahead. Is that Rebecca under there? Hi, Rebecca. Good to see you.
Appropriate. Like you could kind of hold two, more, you don't have to take sides there, you can kind of find, right, share responsibility. Like this one, hold both sides accountable to interaction.
Great. So Rebecca Stanman noticed how this sort of mapped on to the polarization of America, maybe the world in some way right now, that people very quickly went to like one side or the other. Either Will Smith is right, either Chris Rock is right, instead of saying, well, maybe they were both mostly wrong, a little right. Maybe there's some room to speak about the experience or the phenomenon instead of like being about who was necessarily justified in their actions. Maybe neither of them was really justified in their actions, or maybe on some level both of them were. And what do we do with that? Did I understand that? Okay, great. So David, you had a hand up? Oh, okay. So this David, and then Susan. Yeah. By
intended physical harm, okay? Words are maybe okay, but at a higher level, this goes on so much where, it's revenge in a way. When it goes to a higher level, it can be very dangerous.
Okay, so I'm hearing from David sort of the question of justice. How is justice meted out? Who's responsible for that? What's the relationship between justice and violence? And also, maybe you didn't use the word vigilante, but like, does it raise questions of, right? Obviously, I don't know that I would call that vigilante justice, but it certainly might point us toward how do we understand who gets to respond to something that's done. All right, let's do Susan, and Miriam will have the last word, and then I'll see if I can tie it together a little. Yeah.
I love to, what is humor? Chris Rock has a certain kind of presentation. When you ask him to do, be a part of an award ceremony, then what do you expect him, how do you expect him to perform? Differently than he normally performs? And is humor making fun of him?
Great. So Susan is raising the question of humor. What's the role of humor? What's the role of a comedian? Who gets to decide not just what's funny, but what's appropriate, and where's the line? Right? And if you cross that line, who's accountable for that? Is it the people who ask a comedian who has a particular reputation for a particular kind of humor? Is it on the comedian? Right? So I'm so glad somebody brought up the question of humor. All right, Miriam, yes.
Just a few minutes, not long before, I don't know, not long before this month, the woman who received the Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay for Coda said something really important about how hard it is to be a working mother. And the buzz was about that until the time. And then all of a sudden, the male moment of violence overshadowed a really important woman's voice and a conversation that I think should have been lifted up. And I'm reacting most strongly to the silencing of that voice, which is surprisingly in line with how you started, the silencing of the importance of the winner of that and how that erases other things.
Great. So what Miriam said, for those who didn't hear, is similarly to how Questlove and Summer of Soul, right, also the winner of the award for Coda before, and there had been this buzz. We were driving back from New York at the time, so we weren't watching it, but Miriam's on her phone while I'm driving and saying something just happened at the Oscars, and the buzz had been until that moment about Coda and her comment about being a working mom. And so Miriam lifted up the question of gender and how did the gender dynamics play out in that moment, silencing, redirecting from certain voices and certain considerations to now sort of make room for, men and their violence, right? Okay, great. Thank you. So these are great. I want to respond to a few of these. I have some similar and maybe some different, but mostly kind of the same things I was thinking about as well. So very quickly, I want to kind of just point us toward how might Jewish tradition respond to each of these phenomena so that we can take a moment, which one person told me last night that one of the nice things about, I don't know, nice, but one of the sort of, relieving things about having this to talk about is maybe this felt a little less serious in some ways than some of the things happening in the world right now. So, okay, yeah, we can sort of talk about, celebrities and their bickering and that kind of thing. But however you felt, it was, I think it pointed to some pretty serious considerations in our society, all very quickly, as we've seen happening in just a few moments. So here's a few kind of reflections on some of what we've already shared together. Shame and embarrassment was my first one as well, that I thought of, how it unfolded. If you noticed, right, Will's reaction at first, he laughed, and then, why was he laughing? Probably a pretty nervous laughter, as they're kind of accustomed to, because people are going to poke fun. But very quickly he looked over, and if you saw, he saw the face of his wife, Jada, and she was not laughing, because she's struggled with alopecia, and this for her was shaming and embarrassing. And then he decided to go up and slap Chris Rock, right? So I also thought of what Desiree was saying last week from our scholar, speaking about shame. In her case, she was talking about physical actions that cause shame. Here we had a physical reaction to verbal shaming, but I do think that they're interrelated, right? Specifically, she brought the Mishnah from Bava Kama. If he split his ear or pulled his hair or spit on him or her, right? This could be either or all genders, took his cloak off him or uncovered the head of a woman in the marketplace, he gives 400 zuz. So a pretty hefty penalty for shaming someone. Violence, another thing that came up for me. Jewish tradition has kind of a mixed view on the use of violence to bring about just outcomes, to David's point. Sometimes violence is condoned. Sometimes violence is condemned in the strongest terms. Most importantly, when violence is employed according to our tradition, at least as halakha, as Jewish law understands it, it must be done thoughtfully by a certain designated authority and by, what in in American parlance we might call some version of due process, right? The idea is that there's not supposed to be vigilante justice. Now, to be fair, vigilante justice does exist in Torah, as does violence, even taking a life in self-defense, for example. And it's occasionally obliquely justified after the fact by the rabbis. But for the most part, even the places when the most extreme violence, which obviously this was not that, seems to be okay in Torah, like, for example, the Ben Sorera Moreh, right, stoning a rebellious child to death, which is in the Torah, and is supposed to technically get execution according to the Torah. It's a capital offense. That justice is, one, meted out by the court, two, legislated out of existence by the rabbis, so they say such a child has never existed, will never exist. And oftentimes, capital punishment is sort of commuted for the rabbis to something less than that, and that would be another kind of corporal punishment like lashes, okay? Not that lashes are nothing, but and they limit the number of lashes. 40 minus 1 is the maximum number, 39 lashes. And that's meted out by the court, not the person who was harmed. Third issue, language. We talked about that a little bit. Alan, I think, brought up language. How do we use language? The Torah has a lot of wisdom about this. Actually, this week's parashah speaks to the use of language, because even though Tazria speaks about this disease called tzara'at, the midrashic tradition, the rabbinic tradition, says that what it's really about is lashon hara. How do we use words? Words can be used to destroy. They can be used to harm and to hurt. Words can also be used to build up. God creates the world with words. And so the rabbis say, not in a prescriptive way, but in a descriptive way, the story of Tazria Mitzora is really about how language spreads when it's not used properly, right? Not that if you say the wrong words, you're going to get sick. That's not, I think, any sort of normative theology of Judaism that I would subscribe to in particular. But that descriptively, how does language, how does gossip, how does lashon hara spread? Next, gender and gender roles, right? This question of men's need to defend their women. Professor Wolf last week spoke about emotions and gender. That was actually her third topic, the one in the evening. And I have to confess, I was surprised when the topic gender and emotions was actually very specifically about men and not women. And I think it speaks to probably my own biases, but also I think our societal biases to assume that when we're talking about being emotional and gender, we're not talking about men but women. But actually the rabbinic tradition really pays close attention to the emotions of men and how too often, and they give the example of the sota, there need to be structures in order to keep men's strong emotions in check. Now, I'm not willing to say that that's necessarily any more fair as a blanket characterization of male folks than any sort of prejudices we may have, blanket assumptions about female folks, but that is what the tradition talks about. Race. It's interesting that we didn't name race. Here's what I noticed. Chris Rock made this comment when he gave the Oscar after this whole thing, after the slap to Summer of Soul. He made a joke. Did you catch what his joke was? Questlove and 4 white guys. Right? He was trying to sort of laugh it off, but you may have seen that that didn't go over well for Joseph Patel, who is of South Asian origin and who won the award along with Amir Questlove Thompson and 2 white guys, right? So it was 4 total people, 2 of whom were people of color. That was something that we might want to pay attention to in this country. What about the huddle afterwards between Denzel Washington and Tyler Perry during the commercial break? What about Sean Combs' comment about handling this as a family, quote unquote, or the comment about Smith and Rock being brothers? Most importantly, what does it mean to witness those moments, to look at something so raw and painful for those of us who are not black? So was there something in this about voyeurism as well? Is that an issue we might consider about who gets to look on and who should be looking on when certain conversations are being had, and what does entertainment and the entertainment industry offer to us that may be in some ways an abrogation of the notion of being really created in the image of God? Our tradition, at least in its classical sources, doesn't address race directly. Bigotry, for sure, othering, yes, but race, for example, anti-black racism is hundreds, right, as we understand that term, that's hundreds, not thousands of years old, right? So bigotry is older. Bigotry, including against skin color, is older for sure. But what we understand of as racism in America today, that's not an ancient phenomenon. That's something more recent, though unfortunately not that recent. So we can extrapolate. Certainly I've done so at times. But what I do think is that this encounter, as experienced by millions around the world, speaks to a related concern which is definitely addressed in our sources, and that's the question of voyeurism. And what I want to share with you, I have 2 sort of quick sources to conclude. One is in the Midrash about Bil'am. Who is Bil'am? Right? The guy with the donkey. Okay? Bil'am was the guy with the donkey. So Bil'am is called upon to curse the Jewish people, and he ends up blessing the Jewish people. And when he blesses the Jewish people, he opens his mouth and he says, Ma tovu alecha Yaakov, mishkanotecha Yisrael. How goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. So the rabbis ask this question, why does he say that in particular about the dwelling places and the tents? What he notices are, according to the Midrash, the tents of the Jewish camp in the wilderness were positioned in such a way that the entrances of each tent was not across from each other. In other words, they were, as a society, making a deliberate choice to preserve modesty, to not place anyone in the position where someone else can peer through the window of someone else's home. And that's why he says, Ma tovu alecha Yaakov, according to the Midrash. What's the takeaway here? Right, that our tradition really wants us to be mindful about where we gaze, where we send our gaze. when we should look away, when we should turn it off, maybe when we shouldn't engage. That might be also part of the story here. Finally, thank you, Susan, the role of humor. This whole thing started with a joke. What's the role of humor from an ethical perspective? I think is a fair question to ask ourselves as Jews, since for us, humor is clearly so central to our identity and has been one of the chief mechanisms through which we've survived how many horrible things that we've been through as a people, right? When Mel Brooks, creates a song called Springtime for Hitler, that is an act of defiance, right? It's funny, but it's also quite serious. He's doing something subversive and important, and that helps us survive. So allow me to end with a Talmudic story that comes from Masechet Bava Kama that speaks, ironically, to the events of last Sunday evening, as well, I think, as to the place and purpose of humor. So here's the brief story. A certain man named Hanan the Wicked, so we kind of know where this is going to go from just his title, right? He's Hanan the Wicked. He slapped another man. He then came before Rav Huna for judgment. Rav Huna said to him, go give him half a dinar, right? Half a certain monetary value, which is the fine imposed for such an act, for slapping someone. Hanan the Wicked had only a full dinar, and there was some issue with his particular dinar that he wasn't able to make change, right? The penalty is only half a dinar, but all he had was a whole dinar. So what happened? Hanan the Wicked slapped him again, and then gave him the entire dinar as payment. So what's the moral of the story? Go see Summer of Soul. It's a really good movie. Also Coda. The Oscars, worth a watch? I'm honestly not sure. Shabbat Shalom.